Today we're going to be talking about how the Bruderhof fits into Anabaptism, because it's kind of a unique story.
Right. The first thing to say is that although we draw inspiration from the early Anabaptists, particularly the communities that formed in Moravia, led in part by Jakob Hutter, which is why they were called Hutterian, they are only one of a number of movements that go back to the very earliest times of Christianity. The difference being is the Anabaptists were super prolific in their writing, so we can learn about how they thought.
Eberhard and Emmy Arnold, who founded the Bruderhof together with Emmy's sister Elsa, grew up Lutheran. Eberhard's father, Franklin Arnold, who was a professor of church history and a staunch Lutheran himself, was the first to turn his son on to the baptizer movement, speaking positively about the early 16th century Moravian communities. But, Franklin Arnold said, the fact that they were persecuted violently by the authorities was proof that it wasn't God's will.
Which is kind of an odd position for a professor of church history, if you ask me. The interesting thing is that Eberhard and Emmy didn't set out to start an Anabaptist community, per se. What happened is, after they had witnessed the devastation of the First World War, they were living in Germany, they read the Sermon on the Mount, and they kind of saw it with fresh eyes, and were inspired to set out to create a life based on that very demanding set of instructions. I mean, really, read it and imagine actually trying to live it out. They were also inspired by the accounts of a radical sharing community in Acts 2 and 4. And it was only later when Eberhard realized that there were still Anabaptists living in Community of Goods, the Hutterites in North America, that they took steps to affiliate themselves with them, with those communities.
And Eberhard Arnold, he spent about a year, right, traveling among the colonies in North America. And his letters from that time really reflect this enormous joy and rediscovery of this movement that he had thought dead for 400 years. And it's also clear from his correspondence that he was worried that in 400 years a movement can drift, sometimes unintentionally, from some of its founding tenets, which were set down so clearly in the original books and letters. The wonderful thing is that the Hutterian Church made many of these century-old documents available to Eberhard and to the Bruderhof, and a new season of inspiration began back in Germany as all the members read and reread these clear testaments to a common life, lived on gospel truth.
So then, the Bruderhof was incorporated into the Hutterite Church in 1930. Eberhard was accepted as a minister and commissioned to continue to lead the small community in Germany, which took on many of the Ordnung, or orders, of the Hutterite colonies, including their mode of dress at that time. And you can still see that today. The publishing house was commissioned to reprint some of the oldest Anabaptist writings as well. There were also visits from American Hutterites to the Rhön Bruderhof over the next years, which were actually very dangerous years to be witnessing to nonviolence and love of all humanity in Germany, because Hitler. The Nazis' rise to power threatened the safety of the Bruderhof, and in at least one case, it seems that the presence of two Hutterite ministers on the premises was the only thing that protected the community's continued existence. So there's, quite a rich history of the relationship between the Hutterite Church and the Bruderhof, and there's been plenty of ups and downs over the years and varying degrees of separation and then working together again. We parted ways in 1995, but we still find ways to connect, for example, through our publishing house, and we'll talk a bit more about that later.
So, how do we still measure up as Anabaptists?
Well, if you go through the Schleitheim Confession, which was written by Michael Zattler in 1527 and recognized as an articulation of elements that are distinctive to Anabaptism, I would say the Bruderhof comes close to ticking every box. Adult baptism, number 1. Application of the direct address, described in Matthew 18, to correct one another, is number 2. Lord's Supper, taken only with those who have been baptized as adults, who affirm the same confession of faith and who we're at peace and in unity with. It's a little tricky with point 4, which has to do with separation from the world, because, for us, we partner and count as friends, many people and organizations beyond our community.
That's true. But we do try and remain independent from the individualistic consumer culture in the way that we dress and the cultural influences that we tolerate as a community. Now, point 5 has to do with leadership. People who are appointed to take on responsibility for guiding the community in spiritual and temporal matters as well, but who are responsible to the membership body, and they can be removed if their leadership is ineffective or harmful. The Bruderhof's approach to pastoral leadership is in line with the Schleitheim on this point. We're also in complete alignment with point 6, which has to do with unconditional nonviolence that would preclude military service, self-defense, and holding a position as a judge or a juror. And also point 7, which is about refusing to take oaths in accordance with Jesus' teaching.
One thing that isn't mentioned in the Schleitheim Confession is community of goods, and I think that was pretty intentional. That first comes up in another document, the similarly named Schleitheim Congregational Order, which was written at the same time and in the same hand, so probably also Michael Zattler. And point 5 of the order states that members should not have anything of their own, but should hold everything in common.
You know, what's interesting is the progression of community of goods or common ownership. It went from this ad hoc, flexible system of mutual sharing to this very fully structured communalism, which became the hallmark of the Hutterite Church. The Hutterian Chronicle, which is a book this thick now, but back in the day was a loose-leaf journal that people kept alive, documenting their history and as they fled over these very high mountains, fleeing persecution, documents the first time this happened. And how it happened was this way. An underground Anabaptist congregation in Moravia of over 200 people was forced to flee the land they were on with practically no warning. And because of the difficulty of moving a large group which included children, they appointed people to be responsible for practical matters. And so the chronicler wrote, "These men then spread out a cloak in front of the people, and each one laid his possessions on it with a willing heart, without being forced, so that the needy might be supported in accordance with the teachings of the prophets and apostles." So there's echoes of Acts 2 right there.
But without force.
Right, non-coerced.
Over time, this practice was formalized and defended as an article of faith with appeals to Scripture. The example seen in God's creation or the divine economy, the ethic of love, the concept of Gelassenheit, which is a German word which means total surrender to God and the church, and also to history. For the Bruderhof, community of goods does not rise to the level of an article of faith, but it's rather a practical way to live in accordance with all of these points.
The way that you do it isn't as important as the fact that you do it at all.
Right.
Well, that pretty much covers it for Chapter 2 in our Anabaptist series. Make sure that you subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when we upload the next one.